I do hope this is not the lunchtime session where you start to fall asleep afterwards, though. So we have a nice stimulating topic coming up for you next, which hopefully will keep you reinvigorated. Before I start handing over to Richard Everett, who's going to lead this session for us, I'd just like to say that the course of this morning's discussion has been picked up by the Times Higher Education, that they have articles on their website, that they have put the link to the live feed for this event through their website. So you're going out globally. Also, apparently we're going down a stream in Mexico. So there's ladies and gentlemen in Mexico in the higher education sphere who are following our conversation. So hello to Mexico, is all I'll say. And we hope that Mexico can send us some tweets back with some questions. We'd like to get your feedback as well. With that, I'd like to hand over to Richard Everett, Director of Education for British Council in India, for the next session. Richard.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm not sure what time it is in Mexico, but good they're awake and engaged with it. But so Michelle's absolutely right. Often after lunch on these events, you've got to settle down and digest your food and relax into your seat, which of course you can do. But as long as you listen hard and take part in this next session, which is a critical one, quite an interesting one for the topic around the myths and realities around academic appointments. And you heard from Louise this morning, from Peter and lots about the disproportionate number of senior positions held by women across the world, actually, and especially South Asia. Some 3% across the world of female vice-chancellors. But if you look at distribution of that 3% and compare it against university rankings, probably go even less than that if you talk about things like the QS or Times Higher top 100 or 200 universities. Anyway, to discuss this kind of issue, and which you'll have engaged with as well, we'll have two speakers and then someone who's going to make some reflections on those presentations. And I'm first going to introduce Patrick Johnson. Patrick is the Head of Equality and Diversity at the University of Manchester, back in the UK. He leads on the kind of diversity strategies for the university, and he's also qualified in an expert in careers guidance. So bags of experience in the UK sector. He's not from Manchester. He told me he's an Aston Villa fan, if you're football fans, who would of course at this moment do with the help from Lillian Parr, the football genius from the 1950s. But anyway, Patrick will go first. Then we'll have Dr. Fahima Aziz, the Vice-Chancellor from the Asian University for Women based in Bangladesh, and you may have heard her speak in the session downstairs before lunch. Did most of her academic career in the States, so brings that kind of States from Minnesota and other parts from other parts around the world as well. Lots of interesting policies and understanding around that too. And then, of course, we have then some reflections on those two presentations. We've got Aloka Parashir Sen, who's the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Hyderabad, who has actually given talks on this topic really around the world. She was a DAAD fellow in the 80s at Heidelberg University in Germany. In the 90s, she went to work at UC Berkeley on a Fulbright scholar. She's also studied and worked in Canada and all sorts of places, but she's here with us today and London, of course. Okay, so we've got this. So we've got a unique panel to bring together. This hot topic. You know the drill. They'll give their presentations. There'll be a bit of Q&A, and then I'll be thrown open to the floor for our discussion period. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome, please, to Patrick Johnson.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I said my name is Patrick Johnson, Head of Equality and Diversity at Manchester, and I think what I'd like to do is, I suppose, talk to you more about the practice in terms of looking at diversity and particularly looking at women in leadership positions. I thought I'd start with this particular slide because it's quite an interesting one. I think a lot of people, when they think about equality, they think about treating everyone the same as being equal. I think this particular slide for me is great because it shows that's not exactly the case. By treating everyone the same doesn't necessarily mean that it's equal and it's fair. It's very important in terms of looking at the criteria that one uses in terms of looking at who you want to recruit. I don't know if you can read the slide well, but it says for a fair selection process, everyone has to take the same exam. So please climb that tree. So as you can see, for one of those particular candidates, it's going to be quite an easy job. For others, not so easy. So it's about how do we ensure that there's a level playing field. So it's quite important to think about the actual criteria that we use. And I think that leads very nicely in terms of thinking about the language that we use when we think about recruitment and we think about leadership as well. And I think some of the things I'm going to be talking about is just really echoing some of the discussions and some of the comments that have been made throughout the day so far. So one of the things, particularly looking at unconscious bias, and unconscious bias is for me in the UK, it's quite interesting. Unconscious bias is it's the buzz phrase at the moment that everyone talks about, and it's quite comfortable because you can talk to people about discrimination without mentioning it. So I can't go up to and say that you're racist or you're sexist or whatever else, but I can talk about that they're being unconsciously biased in some way. So it's more acceptable, I think, to talk about people who have that everyone has an unconscious bias, and it can impact on everyone. And I think that includes women as well as men when we look at leadership positions and we look at recruitment as well. And I suppose on that unconscious bias, I just want to give you, I suppose, an example if you haven't heard about unconscious bias before. One of the great examples that I like to use is looking at symphony orchestras and going back to the 70s. Used to be in the UK very male dominated in terms of symphony orchestras, and a lot of people couldn't understand why that was. Lots of great female musicians, but for some reason they're not quite making the grade and getting into the symphony orchestras. And the people who were doing the auditions and doing the recruitment didn't understand it. And I actually hear the same thing when I talk to our senior leaders at the University of Manchester. We don't see anything. I don't see gender, I don't see colour, I don't see, no, we just treat everyone the same. We want the best person for the job. That's all we want, and we'll recruit the best person for the job, and that's exactly what we're doing. And I actually believe that's what they're thinking, and that's what they're trying to do. But there's something at play if we think about the symphony orchestras where the women are not getting through. So someone came up with a brilliant idea to actually devise a screen. So when it came to an audition, the only thing that they did was to put a screen in front of them when they're auditioning, because you don't actually need to look at the person when you're deciding who's the best person for the orchestra. You just need to listen to them play. So they had this screen and they had the blind audition. So all they did was listen to the person playing and then made a decision. Within the space of a few years, there was a dramatic increase in the number of women who were recruited to symphony orchestras. And that's by way of just illustration how, for some people, they truly believe that they're making the right decision and they're recruiting only on merit. But there's something that's happening implicitly that's making them make another decision. And there's something around the stereotypes that we have of being a leader, how it may be about recruiting in our own image. And I mentioned before about some of the criteria that's used as well. So I think there's something that we need to think about around the language that we use in recruitment, about that criteria, and also about acknowledging our unconscious biases as well. Networks is one of those really important things that people talk about and can have a real impact. And I think people talk about the old boys network, about people talking to each other and having favours to move on within organisations. For a lot of women, that's not necessarily the case, and sometimes you can be quite isolated within a senior position if you're the only woman in terms of having access to some of those networks. One of the things that we have done at Manchester is we developed a women professors network. So that was quite important, and it was quite a great opportunity. We had about 176 women professors who come together, and actually it's quite a supportive network, but it's also very useful in terms of work. So there's lots of interdisciplinary work that's actually taking place off the back of actually getting these women together and actually discussing different ideas. So I think networks are really important in terms of helping people, in terms of developing. And I think it's really important because some people have mentioned before about it's quite difficult if you're sort of the lone voice trying to make a point. You don't see that it's just that woman making that comment. We're going to ignore that. Actually, if you got 176 people saying exactly the same thing, the university actually stops and listens to what's going on. So actually having that collective voice is quite important. When we look at senior leadership positions, in the UK, tens of thousands of pounds are spent with executive search agencies in terms of finding the best person, and there's an international search that takes place. We've had 2 in the last 6 months or so at Manchester for a Dean of Medical and Human Sciences and 1 for Engineering and Physical Sciences. So this global search takes place. And one of the questions is that when we look at the long list, it tends to be a lot of the usual suspects that are on there. And I think sometimes executive search agencies can have a real impact in terms of the people that get recruited into senior leadership positions. So I think looking at executive search agencies, it's actually calling them to account. So we're fortunate at Manchester that we have a female Vice-Chancellor. And what she says is actually, do not come back to me with a long list that doesn't have at least one credible woman on that long list. So that's quite important. It's actually calling those executive search agencies to account and actually getting to do a bit more research rather than just using their usual networks, I think is quite important. Mentioning about imposter syndrome. This is something which you may have heard of before, and something that I think is quite real, and there's been a number of training sessions that we've done around the imposter syndrome that a lot of people relate to. And it's about how you feel about yourself, and whether you actually see yourself in a particular position. So some people in leadership positions, and if you're a woman, sometimes if you're an ethnic minority or from another underrepresented group, you feel like you actually don't belong there, or you're actually lucky to be there. So it's quite difficult. If we talk to some women professors, a lot of them talk about actually sometimes they feel lucky to be in the position that, so they don't actually think that they can go on and be a leader, be a head of school or something else, because they feel that actually, am I really good enough to be here? I don't see other people like me in senior positions, so actually should I be there anyway? So that imposter syndrome can actually have an impact. I think Louise and other people mentioned earlier today about the work-life balance is really important. I'm not going to make any apologies. I will be talking about numbers and the importance of numbers, because I think numbers are important, but I think it's not the only thing, and we actually need to look at both sides. So that balance is really important. It's about whether leadership as it stands is an attractive career proposition to women, but also to some men as well. And it's what we mean by leadership. Could I just mention, in the UK, someone, I think it was Rob that mentioned first thing that there was 17% of UK Vice-Chancellors are women. The latest figures that I've seen talks about 20%. And we've seen actually, I think over the last few years, a slow increase. The numbers are still quite low, but we've seen a slow increase. If you just go back 12 months, there was only 1 female Vice-Chancellor of a Russell Group university in the UK, and that was at Manchester. There are now 3. So we're actually seeing that there is a slow shift. When we look at people in senior leadership positions, we look at academics, they're nearly always professors. So to be in a senior leadership position at Manchester, you need to be a professor. So when we talk about that pipeline, it's really important to actually increase the number of women professors that we have within institutions. Because people have mentioned not everyone wants to be a leader, so it's quite important that you have that critical mass there, so at least there are opportunities and we have enough people going through. To be a leader, one of the important things is that you need to have budgetary or line management responsibilities in order to then apply to get into senior leadership positions. And sometimes that doesn't tend to happen for a lot of women, where what we tend to see is that women either are interested in or are pushed in a particular direction, and they may be the director or head of admissions rather than the director of research, and sometimes that can have an impact then in terms of looking at going into senior positions. I've mentioned that 30% is our magic number. That's a general thing that a lot of people in the UK and elsewhere are talking about, in that to have a meaningful input, you need to have at least 30% of women on within a senior leadership team, for example. Otherwise, sorry, let me go in the right direction. Otherwise, it can be quite difficult to get your voice heard and being that sort of lone voice. You may not be able to read it. It says, that's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to actually make that suggestion. And I think it's quite important that we look at, as I say, it's not just about the numbers, but I think numbers are important in terms of getting your voice heard. And I'll quickly just finish off by just mentioning a few things at Manchester. The leaky pipeline's already been mentioned. When we look in, Manchester is probably typical of a higher education institution in the UK in terms of the number, and I imagine similar to other countries as well, where we have a good representation. 52% of undergraduates are female. As you go through, 44-45% of our lecturers are women, through to 35% senior lecturers, 22% professors, and we can see that sort of leaky pipeline effect. So what we've actually said at Manchester in terms of our strategy, and it's actually written into our key strategy, there's a performance indicator that to increase the equality and diversity at all levels in our staff profile, we've got to make sure that it's representative of national and local populations. So each Dean is called to account every year to have a look at their statistics and to have a look at how many women they have within their particular faculty. And we have 45% lecturers, so we say by 2020, what you should have is 45% professors. And what are you doing to try and achieve that? So it's about actually calling people to account to make sure that you're increasing the number of women in senior positions. We have a Women in Leadership project, where the key aims of the project is to increase the number of women with aspiration, knowledge and skills, as well as experience to be able to apply for a senior management post with a chance of a success that is equal to their male peers. To create a working environment in which both men and women feel comfortable. And I think that's quite important. A lot of the changes that we try to put in place maybe from base in terms of looking at the work environment, maybe from a women's perspective, but actually it's of benefit to everyone, for both men and women. And fight to remove any identified organisational and procedural barriers to the appointment of women in leadership and management roles. And I won't go on. I can actually answer any questions that you may have about any of those particular points, and I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. Great. Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon. Thank you, British Council, for holding this dialogue, very important one, and I truly feel honored to be a speaker this afternoon. And thank you for coming and joining us. I will say things that have been said already, but I just want to have a context to what I'm going to say. We have seen, especially in the plenary session today, studies have consistently shown that within the academia, male professors are privileged over female in all areas and throughout the world. I mean, research in the US, in the European countries, in Asian countries too. And particularly, even if you take a look at the popular website, and if you try to analyze the data in terms of how students have evaluated male professors versus female, you will see repeated comments about male professors being genius, knowledgeable, and then comments like, for female professors, there are good compliments, but more like nurturing, the fact that she has given us the time, but sometimes perhaps even words as feisty and bossy and abrasive come out quite frequently. If you look at the academia in higher education in the US and perhaps in the rest of the world, much of my research is coming from the US and from Bangladesh, especially the institution where I'm at right now.
pay secrecy has been cited as a particular reason for this gender gap. It's not transparent. Therefore, transparency and accountability within higher education is absolutely crucial for a solution to this. So how, and Patrick has nicely talked about all of those biases, unconscious biases. But to offset some of the structural biases, we need strict policy of non-discriminatory hiring practices. Appoint the most qualified applicant for a post, regardless of race, national origin, political beliefs, creed, handicap, or disability, age, gender, sexual orientation, or sexual preference, and its commitment, and it should be committed to equal opportunities for all persons. By the way, the reason I put this up as a hiring practice because we as a team at Asian University for Women put it up only recently because we did not actually have a hiring policy in place. So that's somewhere to start. Do you have a hiring policy? Is it written? Is it in the handbook? Is it in the staff handbook? Is it in the faculty handbook? Again, to offset the biases, appointments, promotions, salary decisions depend both on the qualification and the performance of the individual and the institution's mission. What is it? What are you trying to accomplish? And of course, you have to, the practicalities that you take into consideration, the fiscal condition and the long-term needs and priorities. To offset these biases that we have, we need to be accessible to and workable with faculty who may wish to have children. And particularly this goes for women mainly, but men too, who are wonderful fathers, by providing fully paid maternity or paternity leave as well as parental leaves. And we have included all that. And I'm speaking from my experience that things that you think are very small indeed, but can have a huge impact on others' lives. Especially our mission is to empower young women to be leaders, to lead lives of scholarship and leadership. And for us, it's really important that we as an institution, we are a role model for, we have to practice what we preach, particularly the gender diversity that we have in our faculty. And it wasn't easy. It was a conscious, very conscious effort to do so. I'm very fortunate to be the Vice Chancellor, and I happen to be a female, which is nice. But our associate deans, heads of centers, career development centers, Center for Teaching and Scholarship, Center for International Program, it's very important that we have women at these leadership positions, not just because they are women, but the fact is they're equally productive and effective as leaders. It's just that you have to make an effort. You really have to make an effort to find the best candidate. And quite easily you can find women candidates who are probably the best. Institution must prioritize diversity. We have girls, students from 16 different countries, from diverse socioeconomic background, religious background, Hindu, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, all. So we have to be so mindful when we talk about diversity. We have from different ethnic background, and of course, that the whole area is so conflict prone that we are trying for our students to understand multicultural, intercultural, have understanding of multicultural, intercultural, and also conflict resolution. And we have Indian and Pakistani, Afghan students living together. So we want to create an environment of living and learning in harmony. And that's really what we talk about diversity in terms of not only the student body and the curriculum. We have made effort to make sure the curriculum is diverse in terms of multicultural, intercultural, gender studies, women's studies, global, regional challenges, all that you can do when you talk about your commitment to internationalism, globalization, and women leadership. Faculty body, we are very, very fortunate that we have a good parity in sense of male and women faculty members. I'm going to skip about the OECD. It's not only in OECD countries, in STEM, particularly in STEM, and I'm saying a lot of things that already have been said, but also in the US and in Asian countries. But our support, particularly support of South Asian women's leadership, is an approach that boosts the institution above the entrenched elitism of Western academia, giving it the benefit. We have an American-style curriculum, and we like it. We like the liberal arts curriculum. It promotes critical thinking, problem solving, ethical reasoning, multicultural and intercultural understanding, effective communication. Those are, we think, essential skills of leadership, and those are the core curriculum of liberal learning. But yet we want to make sure that we do not lose sight of where we are, the fact that we are in Asia, and try to do the best. So take the best of the both worlds in terms of the Western curriculum that we have, and then having the South Asian culture with it. And part of it is, there was a question this morning, do we need women in leadership positions? What do we do? Why do we need women in the leadership position? And it has been said, a number is important. Of course, it is not a sufficient condition. It is important in the sense you need a critical mass. I mean, even Pratik's last picture, one woman on the board, a room, you need a critical mass. But importantly, it's about fairness. It's about having an egalitarian society, but also we need women to make important decisions regarding budgetary management, operational, and leadership decisions. And also it's important to have women as role models. That's really important. You can't be what you can't see. So you need a visible, healthy role models to inspire and for emulation. Therefore, a fair and equal hiring is necessary to ensure fair representation within our faculty, administrators, but essentially to achieving our mission. And that is at the heart of every single policy that we have. If you can really focus your folks, then what is the mission of the institution, and how does this policy adhere to this, you can actually accomplish quite a lot. And if you can bring the students at the center of everything, the heart of the institution, learning, and things get much easier in difficult conversations. Research shows that sometimes the administration, good school administration, is more attuned to feminine models of leadership. I don't know whether you know, but there's lots of research on what are the feminine models and masculine models, being sensitive, being empathetic. I mean, you would think both genders would have it, but this has been attributed as more feminine attributes: intuitive, compromising, caring, cooperative, accommodative. And these are associated being as effective leadership and management. And we find that more women having more of these. Data on equality of opportunity in educational administration reveals that gender, more than age, experience, and background or competence, determines the role of an individual will be assigned in education. And I do not need to emphasize that. We know that. Especially occupational segregation is in all areas, but particularly in academics, where we study occupational segregation. We did very well starting from the 60s, actually, 70s and 80s, the occupational segregation actually went down, the index went down. And then after the 80s, it's just flat. It is not even getting any better. And we see that so much in the academics in terms of leadership position. There was a research study in Bryn Mawr, a summer institution, where women in higher education were asked the same sort of questions that we're asking, and to talk about the obstacles that they face. And they listed them: lack of experience, lack of education, personal and family responsibilities, lack of mobility. That's why work-family balance is important, all the things that we have talked about. But then what can be done? What should we do? And how can I as an individual make a difference, or you can make a difference? Sometimes, and Patrick has touched on this, a publicly stated personal and institutional commitment by the board, I'm sorry for the spelling error, but boards and the CEO and the vice chancellor, You have to address, you have to front the issue, you have to address the issue that this is a problem, and it has to come from the top management. Insist that qualified women and minorities will be interviewed and evaluated by the search committee, or the search will be aborted. And when I was in the US, we said, if in the pool there aren't any women, we're not going to be interviewing. And you will be able to find women. Try hard. We'll just delay the search. And we do the same thing in Asian University for women. You just to have women and a critical mass in the. So to tell me that there aren't qualified women, it's really not true. It does take time. It does take initiatives, effort, and strategies. But you can actually find women who are qualified to be in the pool and to be interviewed. Second, of course, women must make a commitment to their own advancement. This is a two-way. I mean, you really have to. We understand all the challenges women face, but we also must have appropriate credentials, understand the organizational structures and political processes of our institution, and of course, to be able to take the risk. And we know research shows that women are less prone to take risks, but women are taking risk more and more, as you can see. Especially I'm coming from Bangladesh, and we have leaders, the two opposition parties are women, and they take considerable risk in their lives. I think that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for your engagement. Yes.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the British Council for having picked up the morning word which Louise said, serendipity, the particular Indian situation. I am an ad hoc serendipitous person, just plonked onto this panel, but that's a good thing because I have this fresh reflection that I can make to both the speakers, whom I heard very attentively, and I'm going to thank both of you for raising, a large number of issues, but I also think that I would like to locate them in the Indian context, so that would sort of give a kind of a complete a whole of a picture. So what I'll do first is that I'll draw upon a couple of points which Patrick raised, which I think are very central to all the countries that we are discussing. One is for hiring, the myths and realities about hiring. I'm going to focus on the question of hiring for academic appointments. A very, very major issue, and I think I'm so happy that he started with that, is looking at the issue of diversity. And as though we imagine a situation that we should be treating everybody the same, but we don't even bother to look at the level playing field. But what I would like to quiz Patrick on is that towards the end of his presentation, he raised the question of we should endeavor towards equality and diversity. And I think that conceptually all of us have a problem of how to handle equality and diversity together, right? There are these issues of are you going to be coming to the table for recruitment because you're the same or because you're different? And if you're different, then the questions that have to be addressed to you should be different or should they be the same? And therefore, I'm raising this theoretical question, and it's not particularly to you, because to zero down on the Indian context, one of the things that occurred to me in the morning was that we are looking at a higher education scenario where there are a lot of women, but the point is that we are imagining a situation wherein we are looking at men as a homogeneous category. And this is particularly in the context of those of us who are working within the Government of India rules and regulations, and that actually women are a group of differentiated group of people in the midst of a large group of diverse men, because we are talking about affirmative action and we're talking about quotas and we're talking about reservation, then a selection committee at a very high level or even at the political level would be looking at diversity in the context of what kind of appointment should be made in the context of, I mean, have there been many women or have there been many men of a particular reserved category and so on and so forth. So I think that if we are going to take up Patrick's point about diversity, then the whole issue of looking at the structure of a university organization and to what extent that university organization is committed to diversity within the structure. It's not that you have a freedom to do whatever you feel like. Okay, so women as a homogeneous category, in as much as men as a homogeneous category, I think that we have to question that right away. That's one of the most important points which I thought that you had raised. And the other which I thought was very important, and I think that this is where I think there's a lot of similarity between what Manchester is doing and I think a lot of some of the Indian universities, where we've reached a point in time where there are a lot of professors, okay, at the university level, and so there are committees. There are various committees where women professors in particular are members of these committees, and it is in these committees that women can play a role for selecting. So I'm sort of going to raise the Indian situation over here. It is also serendipitous that I come from a university where the Vice Chancellor just a week ago has left us, and so we are in the process of looking for a new Vice Chancellor. So one of the things that we have to do, and well, some out of 12 deans of studies, there are 3 women, and the 3 women have to be a part of a committee that is going to start the process. So we haven't discussed in this session, is there a process in place? Is there a structural process in place? If there is a structural process in place, are we effectively using that process? So some of us are using this process so as are you going to debar women or are you going to push women? Are women going to be looked at as victims or are women going to be looked at as, are we going to play a role of emancipating women? So in this process, the high-level committee has to suggest what are the kinds of search committees that you're going to look for? How are you going to go about suggesting names of the search committee? And again, Patrick said that their present Vice Chancellor says, if there is no credible woman in that search committee, just shove that committee out of my way. So these are some of the things that are in place. But to what extent these committees, and that's the reality, that the myth is that there's no process, but there is a process. The reality is, how do these processes get circumvented? And I think over here, I don't know about the UK too much, but much of South Asia, I think that we are all living and working in a situation where at the highest level, whether it's political influences and so on and so forth, or women are also part of that process of being pliable women, some pliable women as well, who then become very symbolic representations of women at high levels of representation. These are very few, of course, but the question is, there is a very, very significant reality of circumventing the process. So that was about the second point that I thought I would raise. And in the Indian situation, we have to either, well, most people, if they want the easy way out, work with the thing. But if you want to really protest, then you have to really protest. I mean, you have to take it to its logical conclusion. Then the question about, from Dr. Fahima Aziz's presentation, there were 2 points I thought that I should reflect on. One was that she made a very significant, from my point of view, very significant, that there's pay secrecy at very, very high levels of selection in Bangladesh. I assume you were giving examples from there, and that there was no hiring policy till recently, and so on and so forth. I think that we don't have that in India, pay secrecy. So if you're going to be a vice chancellor, or if you're going to be a professor at a certain level in your 14 years or 15 years, I mean, there is like a normal process. I don't think anybody, there is no secretive process of having pay secrecy. But the hiring process, of course, is as per Government of India rules if you're working in the government, and of course if you're private universities. Now that's a totally different kind of situation. Now in the private universities, one of the issues that is being raised very vehemently is, of course, there are very high pay packets, but the question is the process, I mean, what is the process? Is it, networking? That's another point, that, is it networking, and then you get the best, so-called best from the system? But if you're within a government system, or within a university that is governed by the government rules, then this question of pay secrecy and what would be the hiring policy, what would be qualifications, etc., this is all set, right? So there's no way, and this has been set for a long, long time. So there's no way in which you can say, oh, she has 40 years of experience and she's very good, she's a leader in her area and all that, etc., etc. If she is circumvented, she's circumvented because of the point I made about interference, about circumventing. That is a conscious political decision, and that is a reality. So now, just a couple of points which I want to bring in from my own end. This can be, my colleagues are here, many of them working very closely in this area of women's studies. But what I feel is that in higher education, well, don't take this literally, but metaphorically, there's a big bulge at the waist. Women are at very, large number of women are at the waist level, in the sense that I think there are lots of very well-known, in fact, our role models were women in higher education when we got into education, and so like that's going back to the 70s and so on and so forth. But the head is very slim. So this is so again, metaphorically and literally, women are slim on the top, or they are slim inside, right? I mean, what is it? But that if you look at any statistical imagery that you will get to know, and even the projections that the UNESCO has made for 2030 and 2050 for China and India, you take a look at it, the bulge is really huge. You take a look at those maps or those graphs. The second point that I wanted to bring in from the point of view of the experience that I have is that, you see, we have a very male perception of leadership. So recruitment, when you're talking about recruitment, leadership roles, and all the qualities that a leadership is supposed to have, we're never ever talking about female qualities. Because if you're going to go by what Patrick said in his first slide, if you're going to go by difference, then I think we have to incorporate in the definition of leadership, and I mean all of us here, in the definition of leadership, to have attributes of different people. So, people, like I'm including men here as well. So there are men who are very good in thinking or in organizing, but there are men who are very, very good in hands-on experience. So also women. There are some qualities in what we mean by leadership. I think that we have to somehow or the other at policy level look at recruitments where the perception of leadership. In the just before lunch session, we were talking about the language that is used in paperwork, and even high-level professors and deans and others have to blatantly look at a very masculine language. He is satisfied that this dissertation I can now go for viva examination. He is fully, 101 times you tell people, please do she, he, oblique. Nobody bothers. So I think that there is a deep structural change that is necessary where it can be made. We talk about mindset changes, then I think we're going into, as somebody in the morning said, patriarchy. You have to take on patriarchy, then you have to take on culture, then you have to take on all these other things. But in higher level institutions, I think that we can make a start by looking at perceiving leadership in different ways and things. And the last point, and this was not raised by any of my co-panelists, and I think Louise in the morning raised raised it, that, you know, women tend to withdraw because they see leadership as being a very corrupt kind of activity. You know, something really corrupt is happening up there. So, I mean, how do we denude leadership from this imagery of it being a corrupt activity? I mean, I don't know. At the present moment when we, you know, I also want to say there's another serendipity. We just happen to be declared by the President of India, the University of Hyderabad, the best university in the country. And so therefore, there is no Vice Chancellor. We are the best university, and we are in the process of selecting this a new leader. And all these three things are sort of, you know, serendipitously coming together at this British Council get together. And I'm like just thinking, I mean, you know, how are we going to identify a person that is totally corrupt-free within the existing structure? So the reality of if there is circumvention and there is outside influences, then is the myth about there being no process. At least in India, we can't say that there's no process. If there is a process, to what extent can this process be led to its logical conclusion? So with these 3 or 4 reflections on my own, and with a very, very big thank you to my co-panelists for having raised very pertinent questions, I think I leave all of you with the thought, equality and diversity. How do we handle that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, all 3 panelists. And I think someone mentioned this morning, I think it's Louise or maybe Jude mentioned it takes us 70 years to get kind of equality in parity in jobs, but we just have 15 minutes, so we should focus the mind on our questions. So now's a chance to ask you any kind of key questions of the panelists immediately. Yes, ma'am.
Very thank you, Richard, and I'm Mona Khare from National University of Education, Planning and Administration, New Delhi. And my question finds its base from my experience of being in the government sector of higher education from a long time. What I am to learn from the experts' presentations is that women's representation at the decision-making higher-up bodies in the higher education system is largely a function of their selections that is happening at the junior level, because it is basically how they progress from there to the senior positions which matters a lot, and also the kind of exposure that they are getting in the managerial and administrative positions down the line. Because what happens, there is a stark difference in the quality and the extent of exposure which is happening for women in institutions of high repute, high quality, developed states, small towns, underdeveloped regions, rural versus urban, so on and so forth. So this quality differential which emanates from the difference in their exposure and their upbringing ends up into some kind of a vicious circle, because even if they get a chance to be at leadership positions in smaller institutes, because of their quality of exposure, they are not able to translate it down the line to their students, and there then exists some kind of a vicious circle which begins to play. So how and what kind of policy interventions would be required to break this kind of a vicious circle, which is going to be very harmful for large education systems, large and diverse education systems like in India? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you like to take it?
We're going to witness more of that, because as you know that there's going to be a horizontal expansion of institutes of higher learning, and that's already on the way. And the problem that you have posed is actually happening in front of us. And yes, the point that you've raised about selection at the junior level leading to, well, there is a process by which one reads to the higher level. And if there is a stark difference in the way in which you select at the junior level, which is of course very substandard and so on and so forth, so obviously leadership qualities will not evolve. But I have one example that we have a school of study in our university that ensures ensures that if you're going to select somebody at an assistant professor level, he should be selected in such a way that he would be ultimately a professor there, because the government of India has now instituted a schema, as you know, which is called career advancement. So obviously you don't really have to go through a totally alien selection committee. You're just sort of graded for the kind of work that you've done. So I think that within the system also it is possible, so long as you yourself said, you ensure that entry level, you're not selecting an assistant professor, you're actually selecting a professor. That is something that has to be done at the institution or the board of study level or the level at which you're hiring. Because obviously, it is this person power that will ultimately lead on to a space that is, at the higher level. So this is absolutely good point, and I think it is related to the question of why are we worrying about women in leadership roles at this point in time? Because at this point in time, the number of women and men getting into the higher education is going to be phenomenal, right? And so we worry about the fact that women will be left behind in large numbers if we follow the template of yesteryears. So we need to change that template, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, this is Sahar from American University of Afghanistan. My question actually relates to the issue of equality and diversity. Well, according to our background of the background that I'm actually coming from Afghanistan, we unfortunately do not have very high qualified women leaders, for sure. And but in the institutions, in the organizations, we have the positions that are for women. Women should be hired because of the policies or anything like that. So the problem is that, so we don't have a qualified woman. In a state, we have, they bring women who are not qualified, just they are performing as symbolic, like a symbol of being a woman in this particular position, but not actually effective for the institution or organization. One part of the issue is, of course, keeping the balance, keeping the diversity, and having women in those positions, because we cannot absolutely ignore women and say no, they shouldn't be. And the other part is, as I know, it gives a very doesn't it gives a bad image of women being leaders, not being in a leadership position but not qualified, and giving this perception makes a big problem of women seen as not qualified leaders. How can we actually solve this? How can we, should it go the way it's going right now, or should it be changed? In which way? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. I don't think this is a separate issue in terms of the two separate issues, equality and diversity. I mean, I think they're both important. It's how you define it. Sometimes I feel equality can be defined in the most general sense, and it's just a human right, that we all need to have equality every place. Diversity, the issue of diversity comes about in terms of our acceptance of differences and how we can learn and learn from different viewpoints or different ways of thinking, or having different people in our institutions. It's for our own, to be a better, compassionate citizen, you have to have a good understanding and knowledge of the differences that are there. I'm not quite sure the question was, but I think we're talking about two different things, and that also answers your question. One is recruiting the best person, and we would hope that that person could be a woman, because we do need women in good position, leadership position. But the other one is retention. We need to have professional training and development, right? And also faculty development, professional development, so that they're not just assistant professor, associate professor, but they can take on leadership position, decanal position, deanship. So those sort of things need to take place simultaneously Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. And let's Petros.
Yeah, and maybe just following up on that as well, I think it's quite important, not just in terms of recruitment, but it's also the women that we have within the institutions already and around that succession planning. And it is about succession planning. And sometimes it can be quite irritating to me when I have people who say that this person got the job because they were the best person for the job, and it just happens to be a man, so that's fine. But where I get irritated is that actually, how did they become the best person for the job? And it's about the advantages that they have had in terms of the opportunities to have experiences of particular things, to be given a particular position that others won't, which makes them automatically the best person to get the job. So yes, you're being fair and you're giving the best person the job, but how did they get there? So there's something about succession planning. It's something about, people mentioned earlier about encouragement and how do we encourage people to go through and support them. Mentoring, I think, plays a strong part within that as well. We have, I think, generally across universities, but certainly at Manchester, what we find, because we analyse, if we look at our promotions for women to go from being a senior lecturer to a professor, we find that very few women actually put themselves forward. And it's not because they're not ready or they've got the right credentials. For some reason, when men look at applying for promotion and other things, they get to the first one or two bits of the criteria and say, yes, I've met that, so I'm going to put in an application for my promotion. Women need to make sure that they've crossed every single one off and they've met every single before they put themselves forward for promotion. But they need that encouragement to say, actually, no, you're ready and you should be applying. So something about that encouragement, succession planning, I think, is really important as well.
Thanks much. Quickly, short.
Yeah, just there was a specific question there, and you said whether we should continue the system where there are very few women in higher education, and also that they're not quite qualified. Should we continue with that system? See, the important question here, which Patrick also just said, is that when you're talking about equality, then you're thinking that everybody should be the same. So if there are women who have a little lesser of the thing, and there is a necessity for diversity to be in the university administration, then I think that it should be encouraged. I mean, you can't have you can have a minimum set of qualifications which are essential. There has to be some kind of benefit, but it doesn't have to be like the absolute, because you see, equality really means, if you conceptually, is like kind of erasure, right? Everybody has to be, this, and so when you're going to inculcate a sense of bringing in diversity, then I think that there has to be what I call negotiating plurality constantly. We have to be in a constant state of negotiating plurality.
Thank you. There was one here first, I think.
Yeah, my name is Shahid Jamil. I am with the Wellcome Trust India Alliance. We fund high-end biomedical research fellowships, and this is something that we see in our own profile, something that Patrick mentioned, that going from 52% undergraduates at Manchester, you go to only 22% professors. And we see the same trend that in our early career fellowships, which are typically somebody just post-PhD or post-MD, we have 35 to 40% women. But by the time you get to the senior fellowship level, there's only about 10%. So I thought it's a good panel here. We have somebody who can bring in a UK perspective, and two women who can bring the South Asian perspective, one from a private university and one from a public university. How do you address this in your own systems?
Thank you. Patrick?
In terms of, it's quite interesting in terms of looking at the figures, and I think one of the issues that we find is around what's looked for and timing of things. So in terms of when women are looking to get into an academic career, and starting on an academic track tends to be also that critical time in terms of family as well. And sometimes I think that also can have an impact in terms of going through. So there are a number of women that we have at the university who have gone through an academic route, got their PhD, started on a postdoctoral research, and then hit a time where actually, in terms of, I don't know whether it's the same in India or other places, in terms of this sort of fixed term contract, not a permanent contract, and keep going on that treadmill and say, actually, I need to have a permanent position. I need to, because I want to start to have a family, and this is not the right time for me, so I'm going to take time out. So then that actually reduces numbers. So what can we look at in terms of what we're looking for and how we support women in terms of that particular period, in terms of those sort of fixed term contracts, but also how we value time away as well. So if I just go back in terms of looking and going through the promotion route, a lot of things looked at is in terms of, if you look at research, it's looking at quantity as well as quality. Whereas if someone's taken time out to have a family, for example, then that quantity is not there. It's only just recently that we've said, actually, we should take that into account. If someone's working part-time, not full-time, we should actually take that into account. If the quality is there, that's what's important. It's not necessarily the quantity if people have had time away. So it's looking at how we look at the structures and the policies to help change how we go forward.
Okay, I'm going to just take just two more questions, and then we'll just conclude. I think we had just one. Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah,
so the thing is, that's why I was talking about the fact that there's this big bulge at a certain point in time, that as you begin your research career, a huge number of women, even in science in particular, a huge number of women into their research up to maybe perhaps postdoc, and then there is this big huge break, and then for them to come back, that's where the tapering begins to happen. And there's, I mean, I say that at that point in that, when we have that bulge, the whole question of cultural and non-academic and non-education factors come into play. And to address those, we have to really handle huge change in mindset, because it's not just simply administrative things that we are handling at that point in time. We are handling non-academic and non-administrative things at that time. And I think all figures show that at that point, women just, have to leave the fellowship stream and the postdoctoral stream and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think this lady was next to the television camera. Thanks.
Question here
just say who you are and your question. Thanks.
Sorry. Professor Aloka spoke about difference principle, the fact that you need to incorporate this in the definition of the leadership. And I think both of you mentioned, Patrick as well as Dr. Fatima, you mentioned the fact of gender stereotyping when you got responses from the students. So we're probably falling into that gender stereotypical categories there again when we look at leadership patterns. And somewhere, I think what we haven't brought in is, yes, which came in towards the tail end, were the cultural factors of valuing time, away from work and stuff like that. I don't know how that can be drawn into policy mechanisms. So suggestions on that quarter.
Thank you.
Maybe you can, yeah.
Would you like to answer, or may I continue?
Very quickly, please, because yeah. Very quickly then. Thanks.
All right, very quickly. You see, time and again, even in the panel, the questions are being raised as why women, why gender mainstreaming, why are we wanting women in higher education institutions in leadership positions? So besides being that it's a question of inclusion, or they are as effective, or it's a question of human rights issue, or it's a question of feminine management. Another very important thing that's come to my mind is that we are wanting to actually mainstream gender in higher education institutions, whether it is in policy, whether it's in curricula, whether it's in management styles, whether it is in structures, physical structures. So gender mainstreaming would be a very significant part of what women in managerial positions in higher educations would do.
Thank you. Okay, who would like to take those?
That's a question. But can I just speak about in terms of the faculty tenure and how, this could be a paradigm shift, but we really need to look at the criteria, how we evaluate faculty performance, because what is in place has been there for thousands of years, and we haven't, how do we define scholarship? We can begin with that. Can we define scholarship more broadly the number of articles in journals or book articles. So those are things we really need to look at in terms of, and then taking into account the parental or the maternity leave. Can somebody stop the clock for the tenureship because somebody's taking time off to raise a family? And they can't. The time is very limited. So those sort of things we need to look at. And it's perhaps a paradigm shift, but certainly what the criteria that are in place or the structures that are in place do not favor women, at least not in academics.
So the question that I had was about difference and whether cultural factors could be drawn into policy. Yeah, certainly. One of the things that has been happening recently, and I was having an informal conversation with the session that we attended just before lunch, it was about, also follow up on what Fahima says about maternity leave. I'll just give an example. In recent years, there is this big, huge Government of India rule that has been brought in where not only women have to access their maternity leave, but I think men also have to access it. And I mean, as an administrator of some small denomination, I actually signed 3 male paternity leaves just before I came. And so I think this was like unheard of. So this is one way in which there's a sensitization happening, a cultural sensitization. The men who are actually the professors in the university are taking maternity leave, and women, well, one of the women was also a faculty, but in the other 2 cases they weren't. So this is one thing. But I was talking about difference, actually sort of to connect to the question from Afghanistan as well, is that, you see, when we are talking about difference, here we are talking about gender, but we also have to, South Asian societies also have to address other differences. I think that, we tend to think that there's a binary between men and women. And I'm like trying to say, look, that binary is problematic. It's like earlier the binary used to be between West and East and Orient and Occident, and all these binaries have to go. There are gray areas. I mean, women in upper class, high caste women have to address the question of difference among men as well. So I'm in a selection process, and I cannot be oblivious to the fact that I have to handle difference of hiring, sensitive to those who have not been in the education stream at all, whereas a high caste, upper class woman has been for generations, as we had our chairperson tell that, she many times said she was lucky. I mean, yeah, many of us have been lucky, right? But the point is not that. So that's why I thought that the question Patrick raised was very fundamentally something that we have to address. If we are going to talk about countries, I mean, we are on the cusp of a transition, but we are not addressing the ultimate question of how can these societies maintain their difference or differences, at the same time move towards a progressively desirable goal like equality, right? I mean, I don't think we should reject it, as she said, that it's a fundamental right and all. Nobody is rejected, because we are standing on the historical ground of having learned about the issues of liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Let's be frank with our historical antecedents. I mean, it was not just part of there was hierarchy, and there was diversity. We handled our diversity very well, but we were a hierarchical society. So I think we have to be sensitive to that, and I don't know really, I mean, affirmative action, reservations, this is policy at a cultural level coming in, right?
Thank you very much. I'm very worried that we're done with time, and so I'm sorry, but you'll have to ask your questions during the coffee break, which follows this session. But I just want to finish, in a nutshell, if at institutional level, in your institutions, if there was one change you would bring to bring gender equality to senior management positions, what would it be? And I'll start with Patrick.
Positive discrimination. One change I would, no, I think it's quite important in terms of re-looking at the criteria and what we mean by a leader. And I think, for me, that's the fundamental thing. And I think when you have a group of men who are sitting around the table coming up with that criteria, then I think that's where it falls down, and you need to have a diverse range of people looking at the importance of leadership and what it means to be a leader. And I think until we sort of look at that and can change what we mean by a leader and get a consensual view on that, then I think things are going to stay the same.
Thanks, Patrick. Dr. Aziz.
I don't know whether I can change one, it's probably, but I would love to change the mindset of how we look at women, and if whether women have the right to have access to opportunities.
Thank you.
So I look at it as equality in having rights to access.
Thank you. Dr. Sen.
So my one word is that I think we really sincerely need to, because our session is on myths and realities about hiring and so on and so forth, and women in leadership roles, I generally think we have to change definitions of what we mean by leadership, making these definitions more inclusive.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please show your appreciation for the panel. And that brings us to coffee. Thank you.